Sarah Bennett sat on the rusted roof of a train car at dawn, hands blistered raw, a torn tarp snapping in the February wind like a flag of surrender. Below her boots, stapled to the warped doorframe, a county notice fluttered. Building code violation. 30 days to comply or removal. 40 acres of scrubland stretched behind her, the last inheritance from parents who'd left her nothing but dirt and debt. In her jacket pocket, $127. In her chest, something that felt like the final breath before drowning. 6 weeks earlier, she'd closed the door to Hartwell Mechanic Shop for the last time. The owner, a weathered man of 72 with oil permanently embedded in his knuckles, couldn't meet her eyes when he handed over the final paycheck. $840 for 15 years of knowing the difference between a seized piston and a cracked block, for diagnosing problems by sound alone, for being the only mechanic in 3 counties who could coax life from a 1960s John Deere when the manual said scrap it. The highway back to her father's barn cut through Wyoming emptiness, past ranches sold to corporations, past boarded-up diners that once fed truckers and families. The radio droned about consolidation, efficiency, the inevitable march toward fewer people doing more work for less pay. Sarah turned it off. She'd heard this song before, watched it play out in slow motion as small towns bled young people to cities, as skills her father taught her became obsolete in a world of computerized diagnostics and disposable machinery. The barn waited like a monument to better days. Her father had converted one corner into living space years ago, back when he thought the family business might outlast him. One room, wood stove, no running water. The rest housed ghosts, tractors cannibalized for parts, engines that would never turn over, tools rusting in the damp air. Sarah heated water on the stove, washed her face in a dented basin, and opened the stack of mail she'd been avoiding. Property tax, $2,400 due in 60 days. The number sat on the page like a sentence. Overdue utilities, $340. Loan payment for her father's last tractor, the one he'd bought thinking he'd live long enough to pay it off. $180 monthly, perpetually behind. A letter from the bank, the envelope thick with legal language that boiled down to one word: foreclosure. She added the numbers on the back of an envelope. The property might sell for $40,000 if someone wanted scrubland with no water rights and a collapsing barn. She owed $18,000 against it. After paying off debts, she'd have enough to rent an apartment somewhere, maybe enough to last 6 months if she found work immediately. The calculation felt like planning a funeral for a life that hadn't quite died yet. At 2 in the morning, coffee long gone cold, Sarah opened her laptop with the vague intention of searching for jobs she wouldn't get. The screen glowed in the darkness, casting her shadow against walls covered with her father's old calendars. Years of crossed-off days tracking a life measured in seasons and repair work. She clicked through employment sites mechanically, each listing requiring experience with software she'd never heard of, certifications she couldn't afford, willingness to relocate to cities where rent alone would consume a mechanic's wages. The auction site opened almost by accident, a tab she'd left open from days earlier when she'd been pricing scrap metal. She scrolled past industrial equipment, restaurant supplies, the picked-over remains of failed businesses. Then her finger stopped on the trackpad. The photograph was terrible, shot from too far away with a camera that couldn't focus. A train car, 85 feet of rusted steel, sat crooked on rails overgrown with weeds. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth. Graffiti crawled across panels that had once been painted Pullman green. The description was even worse: 1937 Pullman standard sleeper car. Poor condition, requires complete restoration. $500 or best offer, buyer responsible for removal. She read it 3 times. Something in her mechanic's brain woke up. The frame looked intact beneath the surface rust. The wheels, though seized, appeared structurally sound. The roof sagged but hadn't collapsed. She zoomed in on the serial number, barely visible through corrosion: 4721. She opened another browser tab and started researching. Pullman Company, founded 18th in Chicago, built luxury sleeping cars for railways across America. Peak production 1920s through 1950s, before airlines made overnight trains obsolete. Car 4721, manufactured in Detroit, entered service for Northern Pacific Railway in 1937. Passenger service through 1962. Sold to private ownership, whereabouts unknown until it surfaced in this auction, sitting on abandoned track in Montana. The restoration market appeared in another search. Fully restored Pullman cars commanded six figures, converted into boutique hotels, private homes, museum pieces. But restoration cost 5 times what Sarah could ever afford, required skills beyond her welding and mechanical knowledge, took years of dedicated work. She clicked back to the photograph. The train car stared back at her through its broken windows, a carcass of American industrial history rotting in a Montana field. Most people would see garbage. Sarah's father had taught her to see possibility. Good bones matter more than pretty paint, he used to say while evaluating tractors other mechanics had condemned. She thought about the barn she lived in, about the 40 acres with a for sale sign in her future, about the way her hands knew how to fix things even when her heart felt broken beyond repair. At 3:15 a.m., she sent an email to the seller. Is 500 firm? Can you send additional photos? The reply came 47 minutes later. Price is firm, attaching more pictures. But I'm warning you, lady, it's rough, real rough. The new photographs showed the interior, floor littered with debris, walls tagged with spray paint, bench seats torn apart for firewood, ceiling panels hanging loose. Rats had nested in the upholstery. Rain had pooled on the floor, leaving water stains that climbed the walls like tide marks. No reasonable person would call this salvageable. Sarah wrote back, I'll take it. Can pick up this weekend. The cursor blinked in the sent folder. She closed the laptop before doubt could overtake the strange certainty that had seized her. $650 left after selling her father's Winchester rifle to a collector who'd offered twice before, who'd stopped asking if she was sure about parting with it. The gun had her father's initials carved into the stock, had taught her to shoot straight at age 13, had hung above his workbench like a promise that honest work and accurate aim could carry you through life. She wrapped it in an old blanket, drove to the collector's house at dawn, and handed it over without ceremony. The cash felt thin in her hands, insufficient payment for surrendering the last thing her father had touched regularly, but survival required calculations that sentiment couldn't afford. The flatbed trailer came from the Jacobson farm, borrowed on the understanding that Sarah would fix their combine harvester before spring planting. The Ford F-550 rental ate $180 per day. Heavy-duty hydraulic jacks, purchased used from a closing construction company, cost $320. Grade 70 chain, rated for the load, added 180 more. Straps, blocks, miscellaneous hardware pushed the total past $1,000 before she'd even left Wyoming. The drive to Montana stretched across high plains where antelope watched from fence lines and the occasional ranch house punctuated miles of emptiness. Sarah had called ahead, confirmed the seller would be there, verified the train car's location on county road maps that showed little beyond section lines and the skeletal remains of the rail network that had once stitched America together. Tom Hendricks met her at the turnoff, a man whose 70 years showed in the way he moved, careful and deliberate, conserving energy for tasks that mattered. He looked at Sarah, then at the flatbed trailer hitched behind the rental truck, then back at Sarah. You're the lady buying the train car? Sarah climbed out of the truck, extending a grease-stained hand he shook once firmly. That's right. You know what you're doing? I'm a mechanic. Train car ain't a tractor. Steel is steel. The words came out harder than she intended, sharpened by exhaustion and the weight of every dismissal she'd absorbed over 15 years of being the only woman in shops where men assumed competence arrived with the testosterone. Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recalibration. He gestured toward the overgrown track visible beyond a stand of bare cottonwoods. Let's take a look. The train car sat worse than the photograph suggested. Closer inspection revealed rust that went deeper than surface oxidation. Windows not just broken, but frames bent. One wheel locked so completely the axle had partially fused. Graffiti covered every surface, names, dates, obscenities layered over decades of trespassers, treating abandoned property as a canvas. Inside smelled of rot and animal habitation. Floor sticky with substances Sarah didn't want to identify. Tom watched her circle the wreck, tap the frame with a wrench, crouch to examine the undercarriage. My father-in-law bought this car in 1962, he said finally. Thought he'd do something with it. Never did. Been sitting here since he passed in '82. 40 years of weather. Sarah ran her hand along the steel panels. Beneath the rust, the metal rang true when she knocked against it. Still solid where it mattered. The frame hadn't buckled. The wheels, though seized, showed no cracks. The chassis remained level despite sitting on questionable track. She'd worked with worse metal, coaxed engines back to life from deeper graves of neglect. I'll take it. Tom pulled folded paperwork from his jacket, bill of sale already filled out. $500, exactly as advertised. No hidden fees or last-minute negotiations. Sarah counted out cash while Tom signed, then pocketed the document that made her owner of 28 tons of problematic steel with no clear plan beyond getting it back to Wyoming. The loading process consumed 8 hours. Sarah jacked one corner at a time, each lift requiring 45 minutes of careful hydraulic pressure while she positioned oak roller logs underneath. The February cold turned her fingers numb inside work gloves, made the metal contract and complain with sounds like distant thunder. Twice the jack slipped and she had to reposition from scratch, wasting daylight she couldn't afford to lose. By 4 p.m., the train car rested on rollers. Sarah backed the flatbed trailer alongside, constructed a ramp from railroad ties scavenged from the same abandoned track, and attached chains to the frame. The truck's winch groaned as it took weight, pulling the mast sideways inch by protesting inch. 3 feet per hour, 30 pulls to get it positioned. Tom returned around 6 to help guide the final placement, his tractor adding push from behind when the incline proved too much for the winch alone. When the train car finally settled onto the flatbed, secured with every chain Sarah owned and several Tom contributed, darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. Sarah's hands bled through the gloves, her back screamed from hours of crouching and lifting, and her shoulders carried the kind of fatigue that suggested damage rather than mere tiredness. Tom handed her a thermos of coffee. Long drive ahead. Sarah nodded, unable to form words around the exhaustion. She'd slept 4 hours in the past 48, eaten nothing since yesterday's gas station sandwich, and now faced 140 miles of rural highway with 28 tons of cargo on a trailer the rental company probably wouldn't approve of. The highway unrolled in darkness, broken only by her headlights and the occasional passing semi. Speed limit signs meant nothing. She crawled at 25 miles per hour, the truck and trailer combination, and they're too unstable for anything faster. Every pothole threatened disaster. Every curve required concentration that blurred her vision and made her grip the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. At mile 43, the hills began. The first long descent appeared without warning. 12% grade that had the trailer pushing the truck despite her keeping the transmission in low gear. Brakes heated up, started to fade, filled the cab with the smell of burning friction material. Sarah pulled onto the shoulder, let everything cool for 45 minutes while she sat in the darkness and tried not to calculate the odds of making it home without killing someone. At mile 67, traveling through darkness so complete she could see stars edge to edge across the sky, the first chain broke. The sound, a sharp crack like a rifle shot, jolted her fully awake. She felt the load shift, watched in the mirror as the train car tilted 3 degrees on the trailer. She stopped immediately, hands shaking so hard she could barely engage the parking brake. The repair took an hour. Replace the broken chain with her final backup, redistribute the load, check every connection point by flashlight. 11 p.m., temperature still dropping. Coffee long gone. Sarah's body running on some reserve system she hadn't known existed. Pure stubbornness keeping her upright. She drove the remaining 70 miles in a trance, seeing double sometimes, jolting awake when her head nodded forward. The radio played her mother's favorite station, folk music and blues that carried memories of Sunday mornings in her childhood garage, her father humming along while rebuilding carburetors, her mother dancing barefoot across the oil-stained concrete. The turnoff to her father's property appeared at 3:30 a.m. Sarah had never been so grateful to see anything in her life. She guided the truck and trailer down the long dirt driveway, the train car swaying behind her like a drunk companion, until the barn's silhouette rose against the stars. She parked, engaged the brake, turned off the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. Her hands wouldn't release the steering wheel. Her legs wouldn't respond to commands. She sat for 20 minutes, maybe longer, while her body slowly accepted that the journey had ended without catastrophe. The next 3 days blurred together. Sarah cleared land behind the barn, a 100-foot strip of relatively level ground. She scavenged railroad ties from an abandoned siding 8 miles away, transported them 6 at a time in the rental truck, laid them in parallel lines 4 feet apart. The mathematics of creating a stable foundation from salvaged materials and hope occupied her completely, kept her from thinking about the money she didn't have, the permits she'd need, the impossibility of what she'd undertaken. On the 3rd day, a neighbor with a tractor arrived. She'd called in a favor owed from last year's brake job, and together they positioned the train car onto the makeshift rails. The process took 6 hours. Lower one end with jacks, slide it forward, lower the other end, repeat. When the wheels finally kissed the railroad ties with a metallic groan that echoed across the property, Sarah stood back and looked at what she'd done. 28 tons of rusted steel sat behind her father's barn, a monument to either determination or delusion. The neighbor, a man of few words, accepted the $100 she couldn't afford to pay him and drove away without comment. Sarah walked a full circle around her purchase, seeing it properly for the first time since the auction photograph. This was home now. This wreck of a train car on borrowed rails, held together by optimism and engineering she hoped would prove sound. No running water, no electricity, windows mostly broken, interior destroyed by vandals and weather. But the frame was solid, the bones were good, and she had tools and knowledge and nothing left to lose. That night, she spread a sleeping bag on the metal floor, lit an oil lamp, and tried to sleep despite the cold that seeped through every gap. Something scratched in the darkness. Rats or mice, taking exception to her intrusion into their established territory. Wind whistled through broken windows. The floor pressed hard against her shoulder blades, offering no comfort, no forgiveness. She pulled out a photograph she'd carried from the barn, creased and faded from years in her father's workshop. Her mother in a flannel shirt, laughing mid-sentence at something outside the frame. Her father with a wrench in one hand, the other arm around his wife. Both of them younger than Sarah was now. Both of them gone. She spoke to them in the darkness, voice barely above a whisper. I think I found something. Don't know if it's the right thing, but it's something. The lamp flickered. Outside, a coyote called and another answered. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to believe that broken things could be more than just broken. Morning arrived with frost on the inside of the windows she hadn't yet boarded up. Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that swirled like tiny galaxies. Her body felt like it had been beaten with hammers, every muscle protesting movement, but she stood anyway and began taking inventory. The interior measured approximately 80 feet by 8 feet, minus the space lost to walls and built-in furniture. Bench seats ran along both sides, most torn apart. Sleeping berths that once folded down from the walls hung at odd angles or had been ripped away entirely. The corridor that ran the length of the car was littered with debris, broken glass, empty bottles, newspaper from various decades, the remains of fires built by people seeking temporary shelter. She spent the day clearing trash, filling garbage bags with the accumulated evidence of abandonment. 10 bags, 12, 15. The pile outside grew to resemble an archaeological dig of American decline, layers of discarded lives compressed into a history she was literally throwing away. By evening, she'd cleared enough floor space to move without stepping on something sharp. The walls emerged from behind grime, revealing hints of the original interior. Wood paneling that had once been polished to a shine, metal fixtures tarnished but intact, the ghost of elegance beneath decay. Sarah sat on the cleanest section of floor she could find and ate a can of cold soup directly from the container. 4 days after settling the train car onto its foundation, a sheriff's vehicle pulled into her driveway. Sarah watched through a broken window as Sheriff Mike Donnelly, a man she knew vaguely from town, stepped out and surveyed the property with the careful expression of someone delivering bad news they didn't particularly want to deliver. She met him at the door, still holding the wrench she'd been using to dismantle unusable bench seats. Sheriff, Ms. Bennett, He removed his hat, a gesture that seemed both courteous and ominous. I need to talk about that train car you've got there. Something in Sarah's stomach dropped. What about it? County building code. Any structure over 200 square feet requires a permit if it's going to be permanently placed on a property. He glanced at the train car, doing mental calculations. That's considerably over 200 square feet. It's not a structure, it's a vehicle. Not according to the code. Moment you set it on a foundation, even a temporary one, it becomes a structure. He pulled papers from his jacket. Here's the relevant statute. Building permit required. Electrical and structural inspections if it's going to be occupied. Timeline is 30 days to bring it into compliance or remove it from the property. Sarah took the papers, scanned them without really seeing the words. How much? Permits $750. Electrical inspection runs about $150, structural another $200. That's assuming it passes. If modifications are needed to meet code, that's additional. $1,100 minimum, added to the $2,400 in property tax due in 6 weeks. Sarah did the math automatically, a reflex she'd developed from years of living on the edge of solvency. $3,500 total. She had $27 in her checking account. Can I ask who complained? Her voice came out flatter than she intended. The sheriff shifted weight, uncomfortable. Anonymous complaint. But I'll tell you this much. Douglas Reeves has been buying up properties in this area, made offers on most of the surrounding parcels. He gestured vaguely toward the horizon. Development plans, from what I understand. Reeves had called twice in the past year, offering $40,000 for land worth at least $60,000 if someone actually wanted scrubland in rural Wyoming. Sarah had declined both times without much thought. Now she understood. He wanted the area clear of obstacles, like people who might object to whatever development he was planning. I have 30 days to get the permits and pass inspections or to remove the train car. After that, fines start at $500 per week until compliance. The sheriff put his hat back on, expression genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. I know this is tough timing. But rules are rules. She watched him drive away, then looked at the papers in her hand. The words blurred together, legal language that translated to one simple message. You don't belong here. You can't afford to stay. Give up. Sarah sat on the train car's steps and tried to inventory her options. Sell the property to Reeves and walk away with nothing after paying debts. Default on the taxes and lose it anyway. Find $3,500 in 6 weeks when she had no income, no prospects, and had already sold everything of value except the clothes on her back and tools she needed to survive. Or fight. Fix the train car enough to pass inspection, somehow come up with permit money, prove that she had the right to stay on land her father had died working. The math didn't work. The timeline was impossible. The obstacles were designed to force exactly the outcome Reeves wanted. But Sarah walked back inside the train car anyway and started making a list of what needed to be done. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that pressed on her like physical weight, she explored the train car by lantern light. She'd cleared most of the obvious debris, but decades of abandonment had left layers of history she was only beginning to uncover. Behind the conductor's bench near what had once been the sleeping car's main entry, she found a warped wood panel that didn't quite sit flush with the wall. The crowbar slipped easily into the gap. The panel came away with a groan of old nails releasing their grip on wood that had dried and contracted over the years. Behind it, a hollow space. Sarah reached in carefully, half expecting rats or spiders, and felt her fingers brush something solid. The wooden crate measured roughly a foot square and 8 inches deep, surprisingly heavy when she pulled it free. Dust and cobwebs covered the lid, which bore no markings or labels. The hinges had rusted partly closed, but yielded to steady pressure from her screwdriver. Inside, nested in what looked like old newspaper, lay a collection of hand tools that made Sarah catch her breath. Wrenches of various sizes, the kind with open ends and box ends, forged from high-carbon steel before manufacturers switched to lighter alloys. Chisels with wooden handles worn smooth by decades of use, the kind of wear that came from someone who knew how to hold tools properly, how to let the tool do the work instead of forcing it. A hand drill, manual crank type, that probably dated to the 1960s. A socket set in a leather roll, each socket polished by friction and oil and time. These weren't generic hardware store tools. These were the instruments of someone who understood the relationship between hand and metal, who'd learned their craft before power tools made precision optional. Sarah lifted out a wrench, felt its weight, noted the maker's mark stamped into the steel. Craftsman, from back when that name meant something about quality rather than just branding. Beneath the tools, wrapped in what turned out to be an old shop towel, she found a leather-bound notebook. The cover had embossed letters mostly worn away, but she could make out a name: T. Morrison. The leather was cracked, water-stained in places, but the binding held together when she opened it carefully. The first page bore a simple declaration in careful handwriting. Thomas Morrison, June 1968. This car saved my life. Sarah turned pages slowly, aware she was holding someone's private thoughts, someone's record of survival. The notebook combined technical drawings with journal entries, practical instructions alongside raw confession. She read by lantern light, the flame casting shadows that moved across pages as she absorbed Thomas Morrison's story. Page 5 detailed the purchase. Bought this Pullman car today for $300. Seller thought I was crazy. Maybe I am, but I need something to fix because I can't fix myself. Page 12. Came back from Vietnam with a head full of noise that won't stop. Helen died from cancer 18 months ago. Our boy, gone 3 years before that, 19 years old when some drunk driver decided his life didn't matter. I've got nothing left worth living for, except maybe making this pile of junk into something that isn't junk. The technical sections appeared around page 20, detailed instructions for tasks Sarah recognized. How to weld thin steel without warping it. Specifications for building a stove from salvaged oil barrels. Methods for insulating using materials that cost nothing. The drawings were precise. Measurements noted in fractions of inches, cross-sections showing how pieces fit together. Page 40. Built a stove today following plans I drew up last week. Used an old 55-gallon drum, some pipe, fire bricks I pulled from a demolished building in town. It works. The car is warming up. Maybe I am too. The entries spanned years, marking progress in construction and something harder to quantify. Page 67. Neighbor brought soup yesterday, first visitor in 2 years. He said the car looks good. I said it's getting there. Normal conversation. I'd forgotten. Page 95. 5 years living here. Built workshop space, sleeping area, reading corner. It's not just shelter anymore, it's home. Helen would laugh seeing me in a train car, but she'd understand. She always understood. The later entries grew more reflective, less focused on technical details and more on what the work had meant. Page 140. Someone asked why I spend time fixing broken things. Because broken things deserve another chance. So do broken people. The final entry, page 200, was dated 1980. To whoever finds this notebook, if you're here, you probably need this car like I needed it. A place to hide, heal, rebuild. I've lived here 12 years. Every repair wasn't just fixing the car, it was fixing me. Don't give up. Broken things can be beautiful again. I'm proof. This car is proof. Use these tools well. They're honest tools. They won't lie or quit. Good luck, friend. You'll need it. But more than that, you'll make it. Thomas. Sarah closed the notebook carefully and sat in the darkness. Thomas Morrison's words echoing in the metal space around her. He'd been broken, alone, without resources or hope. He'd fixed the train car over 12 years and somehow fixed himself in the process. She opened the notebook to the first blank page she could find, near the back. Found a pencil in her tool bag. Wrote in deliberate letters, Day 1, Sarah Bennett, my turn. Below that, she listed priorities. Fix roof, patch floor, seal windows, build stove following Thomas's design. Then she added, Thomas said broken things deserve a chance. So do I. The lamp flickered lower, running out of fuel. Sarah didn't move to refill it. She sat in the growing darkness, hands resting on the notebook. Thomas Morrison's tools arranged beside her, and tried to believe that 6 weeks was enough time to prove she had a right to exist in the space she occupied. Outside, wind moved through bare trees. The temperature dropped towards zero. The train car creaked and settled on its foundation. And Sarah began to plan how she would rebuild not just the wreck of steel around her, but the wreck of a life that had brought her to this moment, where the only direction left was forward into work that might save her or might simply be the last thing she tried before giving up completely. She thought about Thomas Morrison, alone in this same space decades earlier, making the same bet against despair. She thought about her father teaching her that good bones mattered more than surface damage. She thought about her mother dancing in a garage while engines were rebuilt around her, finding joy in spaces most people saw as merely functional. Tomorrow she would start weatherproofing. Tomorrow she would begin the impossible task of making this wreck habitable on a timeline designed to ensure failure. Tomorrow she would take the first step toward proving that people like her, people without money or connections or safety nets, still had the right to fight for the small piece of earth they called home. Tonight she just sat in the darkness and let Thomas Morrison's words settle into her bones. Broken things can be beautiful again. She closed the notebook, set it carefully on the cleanest section of floor she could find, and tried to sleep despite cold that made her teeth chatter. The work would begin at dawn. It would be brutal and probably insufficient, but it would be work, and work was the only prayer she knew how to offer. Part 1 complete, 6,477 words. Dawn arrived with the peculiar clarity that comes after sleepless nights when exhaustion finally surrenders to necessity. Sarah stood outside the train car with a cup of instant coffee going cold in her hands, calculating the mathematics of survival. 29 days until the county deadline. 43 days until property tax foreclosure. Materials for weatherproofing would cost at least $200 she didn't have. The solution required earning money while simultaneously doing work that would consume every daylight hour. She started with the roof because everything else depended on keeping water out. The metal panels had corroded through in 7 places, holes ranging from fist size to gaps large enough to see sky. Sarah drove to the salvage yard outside town, the one her father had frequented for 30 years, and negotiated with the owner's son for sheet metal scraps. $80 for pieces nobody else wanted, irregular shapes that would require creative fitting. She bought roofing tar and a box of self-tapping screws, watched her meager funds evaporate, and drove back to begin work that would define the next 2 weeks of her life. Welding on a roof 12 feet above ground in February wind tested every skill her father had taught her. The portable generator she'd borrowed from a neighbor coughed to life after the 5th pull, powered the ancient arc welder she'd inherited along with debts. Sarah climbed onto the curved roof with equipment that felt heavier with each trip up the ladder, positioned herself carefully on metal that groaned under her weight, and began the slow process of covering holes with patches. The technique came back to her in muscle memory. Set the amperage low for thin metal, move the electrodes steadily without pausing, let the puddle form and flow without burning through. Each patch took 30 minutes of concentrated effort while wind tried to destabilize her position and cold made her hands clumsy inside the welding gloves. She worked until her arms trembled from holding the electrodes steady, then descended to rest before climbing back up to continue. By noon on the first day, she'd covered 3 holes. Her hands had blisters on top of yesterday's blisters. The wind had picked up, making welding dangerous, so she switched to coating sealed patches with tar. The smell reminded her of summer road crews, of heat and exhaust in the slow work of maintenance that kept infrastructure from collapsing entirely. She spread tar with a trowel, working it into seams and edges, building up layers that would shed water when spring rains arrived. The sun set before she finished half the roof. Sarah climbed down, legs shaking, and discovered she'd forgotten to eat anything since the coffee that morning. Hunger arrived all at once, making her dizzy. She heated a can of chili on the camping stove inside the train car, ate it mechanically while reading more of Thomas Morrison's notebook by headlamp, trying to absorb his accumulated knowledge before her own timeline ran out. Page 37, detailed window repair. Source glass from old buildings scheduled for demolition. Cut pieces, slightly oversized. Bed them in glazing compound mixed with linseed oil. Sarah made notes in the margin, adding her own observations about modern materials that might work better. The notebook became a conversation across decades, 2 people solving similar problems with different resources. The second day brought sharper cold and news she couldn't ignore. Sarah walked to the nearest farm to use their phone. Her cell service was spotty at best, and called about a repair job she'd heard might be available. The farmer's tractor had thrown a rod through the engine block, catastrophic damage that required either expensive professional repair or someone desperate enough to attempt the impossible for whatever cash could be scraped together. She drove over that afternoon, looked at the destroyed engine, and quoted $85 for a repair that would take 2 full days minimum. The farmer, a man in his 60s who'd known her father, agreed immediately. The money would barely cover materials for weatherproofing, but refusing work wasn't an option when surviving required capturing every dollar that drifted within reach. The next 48 hours blurred into a marathon of alternating between her own repairs and someone else's crisis. Mornings on the train car roof, welding patches and spreading tar. Afternoons at the farm, disassembling the tractor engine, cleaning parts, jury-rigging solutions with salvaged components because new parts cost more than the farmer could pay. Evenings back at the train car, boarding up broken windows with plywood sheets she'd bought with money from the tractor job before she'd even finished earning it. Sleep happened in 3-hour increments on the metal floor that somehow felt harder each night. Food became whatever required minimal preparation. Crackers, canned soup, coffee that was more ritual than sustenance. Sarah's body began operating on some reserve system she hadn't known existed. Pure momentum carrying her through tasks that required precision her exhausted brain could barely sustain. On the 5th day, while fitting plywood over a window frame, she heard a voice behind her that made her drop the drill. Is that a real train? Sarah turned to find a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing at the edge of her property. Skinny frame drowning in an oversized hoodie, backpack that looked military surplus, granola bar clutched in one hand. He stared at the train car with the intense focus children reserve for things that don't quite fit the expected pattern of their world. It was. Now it's something else. Sarah pulled off her work gloves, trying to assess how a strange child had appeared without her noticing. Where'd you come from? The boy pointed vaguely toward the hills north of her property. I live up that way with my mom. Walk past here after school. Never saw a train before. Train. Does your mom know you're here? I'll tell her. His confidence suggested this wasn't entirely true, but also that he was accustomed to spending afternoons unsupervised in ways that would have horrified suburban parents. What's your name? Tyler. He stepped closer, curiosity overcoming whatever caution he'd been taught about strangers. Can I see inside? Sarah hesitated, running through mental calculations about liability and common sense, and the fact that she had no business entertaining random children when she could barely keep herself functioning. But something in Tyler's expression, a loneliness she recognized because it mirrored her own, made her gesture toward the open door. 5 minutes. Don't touch anything sharp. Inside, Tyler moved with careful reverence, touching walls like they might vanish, examining tools arranged on the makeshift workbench, peering into corners where decades of neglect had left their marks. He stopped at Thomas Morrison's notebook where Sarah had left it open. Who's Thomas? Man who lived here a long time ago. Why do you live in a train? Because I need somewhere to start over. The honesty surprised Sarah even as she spoke it, but Tyler nodded as though this made perfect sense. That board's loose. Tyler pointed to a section of floor Sarah had walked over dozens of times without noticing anything wrong. She knelt, tested the board with her fingers, and felt it shift. The nails had worked free over decades of temperature changes, leaving the board resting in place but no longer secured. Sarah pried it up, expecting nothing but the undercarriage framework, and instead found a hollow space between floor and the structural supports below. Tyler crouched beside her, peering into the gap. Could hide stuff there. Thomas probably did. Sarah reached into the space, felt around, and extracted a photograph so old the paper had yellowed and gone brittle. The image showed a man and woman, young, dressed in styles that dated the photo to the 1960s. The man had Thomas Morrison's careful handwriting on the back. Helen and me, 1965, before everything fell apart. Sarah showed Tyler the image. Thomas and his wife Helen. Where are they now? Gone. A long time ago. That's sad. Tyler studied the photograph with the gravity children sometimes bring to concepts they don't fully understand but recognize as important. Yeah, but they were happy here. That matters. Sarah returned the photo to its hiding place, feeling like she'd stumbled onto something private that should remain undisturbed. Tyler stood, brushed dust off his jeans, and turned to face her with an expression of determined purpose. I could help. After school, if you want. Don't you have homework? I do it fast, and I don't have much to do at home. Something in his voice carried weight that belied his age, a loneliness that came from hours spent alone in ways that parents with options would never allow. What about your mom? She works until 7. I'm alone anyway. The matter-of-fact delivery suggested this was simply how things were. Not a complaint, but a statement of established pattern. Sarah considered the liability, the complication, the fact that she had no business being responsible for someone else's child when she could barely manage responsibility for herself. But Tyler was already here, and turning away someone who wanted to help felt like a cruelty she couldn't quite justify. Okay, but rules. Safety first. Tell your mom where you are. And if she says no, that's final. Tyler's face lit up with a grin that transformed his serious expression. Deal. From that afternoon forward, Tyler appeared daily around 4 p.m., materializing from the direction of his house with the consistency of someone who'd found purpose, where previously there had been only empty hours. He held pieces steady while Sarah welded. He handed her tools with increasing anticipation of what she'd need next. He swept up debris, organized hardware into labeled containers, absorbed technical knowledge with the focused attention of someone starved for exactly this kind of practical education. Sarah discovered that explaining what she was doing forced her to articulate principles she'd learned through osmosis from her father. Why angle the torch at 15 degrees? Because the metal needs to heat gradually or it warps. Why leave gaps between boards? Because materials expand and contract with temperature. Why check level twice before securing anything permanently? Because fixing mistakes takes 3 times longer than getting it right the first time. Tyler asked questions that revealed an intelligence operating without adequate outlets. How does electricity flow through copper? What makes steel different from iron? Why does rust form? Sarah answered as best she could, sometimes consulting Thomas Morrison's notebook when her own knowledge proved insufficient, and watched Tyler absorb information with the kind of hunger that made her remember her own childhood in her father's workshop. The barrel stove consumed 3 days of careful construction following Thomas's detailed plans on pages 40 through 42. Sarah acquired the 55-gallon drum from the dump, free except for the effort of loading it. Stovepipe cost $85 for 15 feet of 6-inch diameter. Fire bricks, 12 pieces to line the interior, added 60 more. Hardware for the door, hinges, and damper brought the total to $190. Money she earned by welding a farmer's gate back together and fixing another neighbor's generator. Tyler watched as Sarah marked the cutting line for the door opening, a rectangle 10 inches by 12 inches, positioned to allow loading fuel without having to crouch. The cutting torch hissed to life, flame adjusting to a sharp blue cone that could melt steel. Sarah worked slowly, letting the metal part under heat rather than forcing the cut, creating an opening with edges that would need grinding smooth to prevent cuts. The door hinges required drilling and tapping holes for bolts that would withstand repeated heating and cooling. Sarah showed Tyler how to use the hand drill from Thomas's tool collection, the old-fashioned kind that required patient cranking rather than the instant power of modern cordless drills. The bit cut through steel in a spiral of fine shavings, progress measured in fractions of an inch. Air intake holes went in next, 3 circles drilled near the bottom to feed oxygen to the fire. Sarah explained combustion, how fire consumed oxygen and created draft that pulled more air through the intake and pushed exhaust up the chimney. Tyler listened with the intensity of someone learning magic, which in a way, combustion was. Controlled transformation of matter into heat and light. Lining the interior with fire bricks required cutting them to fit using a masonry saw borrowed from Frank Costa, the retired carpenter who lived 2 miles down the road. Each brick needed to be fitted precisely, gaps filled with refractory mortar that would withstand temperatures up to 2,000 degrees. Sarah worked with Tyler handling bricks, learning to anticipate what size piece would be needed next. The legs, 4 pieces of 2-inch steel pipe welded to the drum's bottom, lifted the stove 18 inches off the floor, allowing air circulation underneath and reducing fire risk. Sarah let Tyler practice basic welding on scrap metal while she completed the actual attachment, teaching him to respect the equipment while demystifying the process. Installing the stovepipe through the roof required cutting an 8-inch hole in the section Sarah had just finished weatherproofing. She worked from inside while Tyler held the ladder outside, passing up sections of pipe that fit together with slip joints designed for exactly this purpose. The flashing collar, sheet metal formed into a cone, sealed the penetration and directed water away from the opening. The first fire test happened on a day when temperature outside registered 6 degrees below zero. Sarah loaded crumpled newspaper, kindlings scavenged from dead branches, and small pieces of oak firewood she'd split from a fallen tree on her property. Tyler stood back at safe distance, watching as she struck a match and touched it to the newspaper. Flames caught, spread through the kindling, began generating heat. Smoke filled the interior of the train car, making them both cough and retreat outside. Sarah had set the damper incorrectly, restricting exhaust flow. She adjusted the angle and smoke began drawing up the pipe as designed, pulled by the temperature differential between hot gases and cold outside air. Within 20 minutes, the interior temperature had risen 15 degrees. Within an hour, frost on the windows began melting. Tyler stood close to the stove, hands extended toward warmth that seemed miraculous after weeks of relentless cold. "It works." His voice carried awe that made Sarah remember the first time she'd seen her father start an engine he'd rebuilt from parts everyone else had called scrap. Thomas knew what he was doing. Sarah added another piece of oak, watched flames wrap around the wood, felt heat radiating through the metal drum's surface. The solar system arrived courtesy of Frank Costa, who appeared one Saturday morning with panels and equipment loaded in his pickup truck. The old carpenter had heard about Sarah's project through the efficient grapevine of rural communities, where everyone's business eventually became everyone else's information. "Found these in my barn. Thought you might use them." Franken unloaded 2 solar panels, both scratched but structurally intact, along with a marine battery, charge controller, and small inverter. The equipment probably had $200 of value, offered without expectation of payment beyond the understanding that debts in small towns were paid forward rather than back. "Frank, I can't afford not selling. Consider it a loan. Or a gift. Whatever lets you sleep at night." He set the battery down carefully, then turned to assess the train car with the experienced eye of someone who'd built things for 50 years. "You're doing good work here." Tyler helped carry equipment inside while Frank and Sarah discussed installation. The panels needed mounting on the roof at an angle that would catch maximum sunlight during short winter days. Frank suggested lag bolts into the steel frame, sealed with silicone to prevent leaks. The charge controller would regulate power flow to prevent overcharging the battery. The inverter would convert 12-volt DC to 120 for running small appliances and LED lights. The installation took most of the day, work that went faster with Frank's experience guiding decisions about wire gauge and connection points. Tyler learned about electrical current, the difference between series and parallel wiring, why solar panels needed to face south in the northern hemisphere. Frank explained with the patience of someone who remembered being young and curious, answering questions without condescension. By late afternoon, the system was complete and functional. Sarah flipped the switch she'd wired to the inverter, and LED strips mounted along the ceiling glowed to life. The light was cold and artificial compared to lantern flames, but it represented independence from the grid, from systems controlled by companies that could shut off power when bills went unpaid. Tyler's expression suggested she'd performed an act of genuine magic. "You made electricity. Thomas's design. I just followed instructions." But Sarah felt the same wonder, the improbable success of turning sunlight into power through silicon and copper, and human understanding of how electrons move through materials. Frank left as evening approached, refusing Sarah's offer of the money she'd earned from that week's repair jobs. "You need it more than I do. Besides, Thomas Morrison was a friend. This is for him." The mention of Thomas's name sparked recognition in Sarah's memory. "You knew him?" 30 years ago, he taught me carpentry when my father died and left debts. Thomas didn't charge, didn't expect anything. Said someone had helped him once, and this was how it worked." Frank looked at the train car, at improvements visible even in fading light. "He'd want you to succeed." After Frank left, Sarah and Tyler sat inside the warming train car, LED lights creating shadows that danced with flames from the stove. The space was beginning to feel less like a wreck and more like something approaching habitable. tools hung organized on the wall. The workbench held projects in various stages of completion. Thomas Morrison's notebook sat in a place of honor where Sarah could consult it daily. Tyler broke the comfortable silence with a question that had probably been building for days. Why are you doing this? Really? Sarah considered easy answers before settling on truth. Because I needed something broken to fix. Turns out fixing it fixes me a little too. Tyler nodded, processing this in the way children do when adults offer them honesty instead of platitudes. My dad used to fix things. Before he died, I'm sorry, 3 years ago, logging accident. Tyler's voice carried the flatness of someone who'd repeated this information enough times that it had become just words. Protective distance from pain that hadn't diminished so much as transformed into something he'd learned to carry. Mom works a lot now, 2 jobs, must be lonely. Yeah, but this? Tyler gestured around the train car. This is good, learning stuff, building things, you're welcome here. Anytime. Sarah made the promise without quite meaning to, driven by recognition of herself in this child who'd found purpose in a rusted train car because purpose was scarce in his world. The following week brought Grace Hayes, Tyler's mother, arriving just before 6 p.m. in a pickup truck that sounded like it needed new exhaust and probably several other repairs Sarah could identify from 30 feet away. Grace stepped out wearing the uniform of a diner waitress, name tag still pinned to her shirt, fatigue evident in the careful way she moved, conserving energy for tasks that couldn't be avoided. You're Sarah, that's right. Grace approached the train car, eyes taking in the work completed, the tools organized with military precision, Tyler visible through the door sanding a piece of reclaimed wood with focused concentration. Tyler talks about you every day, tells me what he learned, what you're building, how the stove works. He's a good kid, helpful. Sarah braced for the conversation about liability, about how inappropriate it was for a strange woman to be spending time with someone else's child, about all the reasonable objections a protective parent might raise. But Grace surprised her. He doesn't usually talk to people. After his dad died, he shut down. Barely spoke for a year. Now he comes home telling me about metal expansion coefficients and welding angles. Something in Grace's expression softened, the defensive armor dropping enough to reveal gratitude underneath. Whatever you're doing, it's the first time he's seemed alive since the accident. I'm just teaching him what my father taught me. It's more than that. Grace looked at the train car again, at the evidence of determination and skill transforming wreckage into something functional. If you need help, I sew, cook, basic things. I'd like to contribute, not asking for payment. Tyler being happy is payment enough. Curtains would be good, gets cold at night. Sarah heard herself accepting help with the same difficulty she'd experienced when Frank offered equipment. The ingrained belief that accepting assistance meant admitting failure, warring against the practical reality that survival required building networks of mutual support. I'll bring fabric tomorrow. Grace turned to call Tyler, then paused. Thank you for whatever this is you're giving him. After they left, Sarah stood in the doorway watching taillights disappear down her driveway. The train car behind her represented 700 hours of work completed in 3 weeks. Weatherproofing nearly finished. Power and heat functional. Progress measurable in daily increments. But something else was happening that she hadn't anticipated. The project was ceasing to be solely hers, expanding to include people who showed up offering skills and time and belief that what she was building mattered beyond its function as shelter. The transformation felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate, opening her to disappointment if the whole structure collapsed, but also necessary if she was going to survive the remaining timeline. Week 5 began with a visitor Sarah hadn't expected. Mrs. Patricia Coleman arrived Saturday morning in a minivan covered with teacher bumper stickers, approached with the practiced confidence of someone who spent their days managing rooms full of children and thought nothing of cold calling strangers about educational opportunities. Tyler tells me you're restoring a 1937 Pullman car. Mrs. Coleman's enthusiasm was immediate and infectious, the kind of person who found genuine excitement in local history and hands-on learning. Trying to. Sarah wiped grease off her hands, self-conscious about appearing in front of a professional while wearing clothes she'd slept in. I teach 4th grade. We're studying local heritage. railroad history, homesteading, how this area developed. Would you consider letting my class visit? Let them see history being preserved? The suggestion made Sarah's stomach tighten with anxiety she hadn't felt since the county inspector had delivered his deadline. I'm not a teacher, don't know how to talk to kids. You don't need to be. Just show them what you're doing. Let them see that history isn't just textbooks. Mrs. Coleman gestured at the train car, at the visible transformation from wreck to something approaching its former purpose. This is real. That matters more than any lesson plan I could write. It's not safe. Tools everywhere. No bathroom. Sharp edges. Sarah listed objections while her mind raced through everything that could go wrong with 20 children loose in a space that was barely safe for adults who knew their way around construction sites. We'd be careful. 20 minutes. In and out. Mrs. Coleman had clearly anticipated resistance and came prepared with solutions. I'll bring parent helpers. We'll establish boundaries. Sign all the waivers you need. Tyler appeared in the doorway, having heard enough of the conversation to understand what was being discussed. Please, my class would think it's so cool. Sarah looked at Tyler's hopeful expression, at Mrs. Coleman's professional enthusiasm, at the train car that represented weeks of work nobody but her had witnessed. The idea of opening that work to judgment felt exposing, but refusing help from people who wanted to support what she was building felt like a different kind of failure. One visit. If anyone gets hurt, that's on you. Deal. Mrs. Coleman shook hands like they'd just signed a contract, already pulling out her phone to check calendars. Friday work for you? The following days became a blur of preparation that revealed how much Sarah had internalized Tyler's presence and assistance. Together, they cleared workspace of hazardous materials, moved sharp tools to high shelves, swept and organized until the interior looked intentional rather than desperate. Tyler designed a sign using cardboard and markers. Pullman Sleeper Car, number 4721, built 1937, and hung it near the entrance with the pride of someone contributing to something larger than himself. Friday morning arrived with weather that threatened snow but held off, temperatures hovering just above freezing. Sarah woke at 5 a.m., unable to sleep, running through mental scripts of what to say to children who had no context for why an adult would choose to live in a train car when houses existed. She drank coffee that tasted like panic and waited for the school bus that would arrive at 10. The yellow bus appeared exactly on schedule, disgorging 22 children ages 9 and 10 who emerged bundled in winter coats, chattering with the barely contained energy that teachers everywhere learned to channel into productive directions. Mrs. Coleman assembled them into a rough line, delivered instructions about respectful behavior and staying together, then led the procession toward the train car where Sarah waited with Tyler beside her, like a small ambassador. Welcome to Hope Car 47. Sarah's voice came out rougher than intended, nervous about speaking to an audience that included children and adults who had no obligation to care about her project. This train car was built in 1937 by the Pullman Company. It carried passengers across America for 25 years before being retired and abandoned. She guided them through the space, showing the sleeping berths that had once folded down from walls, the bench seats where travelers had read books and watched landscapes slide past windows, the conductor's station where tickets were collected and schedules maintained. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, some genuinely interested, others clearly there because school required it. Tyler took over explaining the restoration process, pointing to patches Sarah had welded, describing how the barrel stove worked, demonstrating the solar panels with the confidence of someone who'd absorbed technical knowledge through constant proximity. His classmates paid attention in ways they probably didn't during normal lessons, curiosity sparked by seeing one of their own participating in adult work. Sarah showed them Thomas Morrison's tools, explaining their history without revealing the notebook's more personal contents. These belonged to a man who lived here 30 years ago. He taught himself to restore this car when he didn't have anyone to teach him. The tools are proof that someone cared enough to do the work right. A girl near the front raised her hand, waited to be acknowledged. Why did you fix it? Why not just buy a regular house? The question landed with unexpected weight. Sarah paused, aware of multiple honest answers that ranged from financial desperation to something harder to name, because I needed something broken to fix. She let the words settle before continuing. Sometimes fixing broken things is how we figure out we're not broken ourselves. Silence followed, children processing an answer that probably contained more truth than they expected from adult interactions. Then a boy in back started clapping, slowly at first, and others joined until the confined space filled with applause that felt wildly disproportionate to anything Sarah thought she'd done. Yeah. Coleman shepherded students back onto the bus 20 minutes later, but several lingered to ask additional questions about welding and electricity and where Sarah learned these skills. 3 parents stayed behind to get contact information, mentioning children who might benefit from mentorship or weekend projects. The attention felt overwhelming and slightly terrifying, opening doors Sarah wasn't sure she wanted opened. After everyone left, Tyler helped clean up the minor chaos of 24 visitors moving through limited space. He worked in contented silence until finally observing, "That went good. Your class didn't think it was weird? They thought it was cool. Because it is cool." Tyler's certainty suggested he'd heard exactly what he needed to hear, that the work he'd been part of had value beyond just occupying afternoon hours. That evening, Sarah sat on the train car's steps, watching sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in winter's muted palette. Grace arrived to pick up Tyler, stayed for coffee Tyler had learned to brew on the camping stove, and mentioned casually that she'd sewn curtains from canvas fabric donated by a neighbor who'd heard about the project through Mrs. Coleman. "People are talking about what you're doing." Grace helped install the curtains over windows that now had glass thanks to another neighbor's donation of old panes from a demolished house. "They're saying it's inspiring. It's just survival." Maybe, but sometimes survival looks like inspiration to people who forgot that was possible. Grace finished hanging the last curtain and stepped back to assess the effect. The heavy fabric transformed the space, creating privacy and an additional layer of insulation that made the interior feel less like a construction site and more like somewhere someone might actually choose to live. After Grace and Tyler left, Sarah recorded the day's events in the margins of Thomas Morrison's notebook, adding her observations to his accumulated wisdom. Visitors came today, 22 children plus adults. They didn't think I was crazy, or if they did, or by fame, they were polite about it. She calculated remaining timeline: 21 days until the county deadline, 36 until property tax foreclosure. Materials purchased had consumed most money earned from repair jobs, leaving her in roughly the same financial position as when she started. But the train car was weatherproof, heated, lit with solar power. If she could scrape together permit fees and pass inspection, she might actually survive this. The thought arrived with equal parts hope and terror, because surviving meant having to continue, meant living beyond the crisis that had consumed her attention so completely that she hadn't thought about what came after. Thomas Morrison had lived in this space for 12 years, built an entire life around the work of restoration. Sarah wasn't sure she had 12 years in her, wasn't sure she wanted them, but the possibility was beginning to form that maybe she could have 1 year, then another, and perhaps that was enough to constitute a future worth pursuing. She closed the notebook, banked the fire in the stove to burn slowly through the night, and lay down on the cot that Grace had helped her assemble from salvaged lumber and donated blankets. The train car creaked in wind that had picked up as temperature dropped, metal expanding and contracting in ways Thomas had documented in detailed notes about thermal stress and appropriate materials. Tomorrow would bring more work, more incremental progress, more impossible problems requiring improbable solutions. But tonight, in a space that was becoming recognizably hers, Sarah slept without quite realizing she'd stopped thinking about giving up as the inevitable outcome of her situation. The cold snap struck without warning, dragging temperatures to 18 below zero in a single night. Sarah woke shivering despite the blankets Grace had brought, discovered immediately that something had gone wrong with the heating. The stovepipe had cracked from thermal stress, a hairline fracture that leaked smoke into the interior and rendered the system useless until she could afford replacement sections. The solar battery had drained completely in the extreme cold, unable to hold charge when temperatures fell below its operational threshold. Frost coated the inside of windows despite the curtains. She climbed onto the roof to assess the new leak that had appeared where ice expansion had separated one of her welded patches, creating a gap water would exploit the moment temperatures rose enough for snow to melt. The repair would require materials she'd already spent, time she didn't have, and energy reserves that felt depleted beyond recovery. 9 days remained until the county deadline. The permits required $1,100 she didn't possess. Even if she earned every dollar through repair work, she'd need to sacrifice time required to complete weatherproofing. Descending the ladder, Sarah's boots slipped on ice. She caught herself but twisted her wrist badly enough that it swelled within minutes. She sat on the frozen ground, cradling the injury and running calculations that no longer added up. The arithmetic had stopped working, variables accumulating faster than solutions. Inside the train car, she discovered the tin box where she kept cash had been pried open. $240 gone, money earned from the past week's work, saved toward permit fees. No sign of forced entry suggested someone had watched her hide the box, knew the layout well enough to find it quickly. Sheriff Donnelly arrived within 2 hours of her call, examined the scene with practiced efficiency that revealed this wasn't the first theft he'd investigated in the area. Boot prints outside showed size 12, common enough to be unhelpful. The absence of damage to doors or windows suggested either incredible luck or familiarity with the train car's vulnerabilities. Probably drifters moving through. Hard to track once they've moved on. The sheriff filled out his report with the tone of someone who'd learned to manage expectations about rural crime resolution. Keep valuables somewhere less obvious. Maybe get a dog. After he left, Sarah inventoried her remaining resources. $85 in her pocket. Tools she couldn't sell because she needed them to earn money. A train car that was simultaneously shelter and obligation. The wrist hurt enough that gripping a wrench sent pain up her forearm. She sat on the steps outside and tried to remember why she'd thought any of this was possible. Tyler found her there an hour later, home from school, immediately recognizing something had shifted in the careful equilibrium they'd established. Sarah? Got robbed, lost cash, pipe broke, batteries dead. Her voice came out flat, defeated in ways she'd managed to avoid until this accumulation of failures tipped some internal balance towards surrender. What can I do? Nothing. There's nothing anyone can do. The arithmetic doesn't work. I needed everything to go right, and instead everything went wrong. Sarah heard herself speaking and recognized the voice, the same hollow tone her mother had used in the final stages of illness when even familiar faces became strangers. Tyler sat beside her in silence that stretched long enough for cold to seep through their clothes. Finally, he spoke with the careful deliberation of someone offering something precious. My dad used to say, when things were really bad, he'd say, one more try. Just one more. That's all you gotta do. One more try when I'm out of money and out of time. Yeah, Tyler's certainty carried weight beyond his years, born from experience with loss that had taught him the difference between giving up and choosing to attempt one more impossible thing. Sarah looked at the train car, at 8 weeks of work that might amount to nothing if she couldn't clear the final bureaucratic hurdles. The structure stood weatherproof enough to pass casual inspection, heated by a stove that worked when pipes didn't crack, lit by solar power that functioned except in extreme cold. She'd transformed wreckage into something approaching habitable through sheer determination and skills inherited from a father who'd believed broken things deserved chances they wouldn't receive in a world that preferred buying new over repairing old. Okay, one more try. The words felt like prayer offered without faith, but she stood anyway, favoring the injured wrist, and went back inside to make lists of what needed doing in the time remaining. That evening brought Frank Costa's truck rumbling up the driveway, but this time he didn't unload equipment. Instead, he climbed out carrying a worn leather folder, moved with the deliberate care of someone whose joints remembered 5 decades of physical work. Heard about the theft. Frank sat on the train car's steps, opened the folder to reveal documents Sarah didn't immediately recognize. Thomas Morrison's estate papers. When he died in 2001, he left instructions. Money from selling his tools and equipment, about $8,000 after taxes, was supposed to go to whoever ended up with the train car. Been sitting in an account accumulating interest for 23 years. Frank pulled out a cashier's check, handed it to Sarah. $12,400. The lawyer who handled Thomas's estate passed last year, left me as executor with instructions to find the right person. Took me 2 decades, but I found her. Frank, I can't. You can. Thomas wanted this. He knew whoever took on that train car would need help. Consider it his investment in proving broken things deserve chances. Frank stood, left the folder on the steps. There's a letter inside, from Thomas, written in 1999, 2 years before he died. He knew someone would come eventually. After Frank left, Sarah opened the folder with shaking hands. The letter, written in the same careful script as the notebook, contained a single paragraph. To whoever inherits my work, the train car will test you. It will demand everything you have and then ask for more. But if you're reading this, you didn't quit. That matters more than money or skills or luck. This check is not charity. It's payment for proving that persistence outlasts obstacles. Use it well. You've earned it. Thomas Morrison. Sarah read the letter 3 times, then sat in darkness broken only by LED strips powered by the battery that would need replacing. $12,000. Enough to cover permits, taxes, materials for repairs, and have cushion remaining for emergencies. Thomas Morrison had planned this decades ago, set aside money specifically for someone he'd never meet, someone who would need exactly what he'd once needed, belief that survival was possible. The next morning, Grace appeared with news that spread through their small network faster than Sarah could track. Mrs. Coleman had proposed a fundraiser. Concert and auction, items donated by community members, proceeds going towards Sarah's permits and taxes. The plan had coalesced in the 3 days since the school visit, organized by people Sarah barely knew who'd decided her project mattered enough to merit collective support. I can't ask people for money. The idea felt like admitting complete failure, like announcing she couldn't survive without charity she hadn't earned. You're not asking, we're offering. Grace had brought fabric and thread, was already measuring windows for additional curtains that would improve insulation. Tyler says you taught him more in 6 weeks than he learned in 6 years of school. That's worth something. Sarah wanted to explain about Thomas's inheritance, about how the financial crisis had been solved by someone who died before she was born, but Grace had already moved on to practical details about the fundraiser. Saturday, 6 days away, Mrs. Coleman coordinating donations, Tyler making flyers, Frank recruiting musicians. The money arrived from Thomas, but the community doesn't know that yet. Sarah's protest came out weaker than intended. So tell them at the fundraiser, thank them for caring enough to organize it, explain what Thomas did, then donate the fundraiser proceeds to the vocational program Mrs. Coleman's been trying to fund. Grace's solution was immediate and elegant, transforming potential awkwardness into opportunity to honor both Thomas's gift and community effort. Tyler took over flyer distribution with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found purpose in advertising something he believed in. Mrs. Coleman recruited local businesses for auction donations. Frank assembled musicians he knew from church, folk band that agreed to perform because that's what happened in communities that functioned properly. Thursday afternoon brought a hybrid sedan up the driveway, vehicles so out of place in the landscape of pickup trucks and farm equipment that Sarah knew before the driver emerged that this was someone from her past rather than her present. Jennifer stepped out wearing clothes too nice for rural Wyoming, carrying uncertainty in the way she approached the train car. Sar. The nickname hadn't been spoken aloud in 2 years, not since their mother's funeral when Jennifer had left the next morning without discussion or plan for future contact. Jen. Sarah set down the wrench she'd been using to tighten bolts on the repaired stovepipe, aware of how she must look. Covered in grease, hair unwashed, clothes that doubled as work gear and sleepwear. I heard about the fundraiser, about what you're doing here. Jennifer's words came out stilted, rehearsed, and then forgotten under pressure of actually standing in front of the sisters she'd abandoned to handle their mother's decline alone. Mrs. Patterson emailed me photos. I had to come. 2 years. You didn't call, didn't write, didn't check if I was alive. The anger surprised Sarah with its intensity, emerging from storage where she kept it locked because feeling required energy better spent on survival. I know, I'm sorry. The apology hung inadequate between them, insufficient payment for abandonment that had left Sarah to manage their mother's final months without support or relief. Why now? Because Jennifer gestured at the train car, at the visible transformation Sarah had achieved through months of work that Jennifer had known nothing about. Because I was a coward. After Mom died, I couldn't handle being here, couldn't handle memories. So I ran. And I told myself, you were stronger. You'd be fine. You didn't need me. But that was bullshit. I abandoned you because it was easier than staying. The confession arrived without the careful language of someone seeking absolution. Just blunt acknowledgement of failure that didn't erase harm, but at least named it honestly. Sarah wanted to hold on to anger, to use it as shield against the vulnerability of accepting that her sister had returned when she needed help most desperately, but exhaustion made defenses difficult to maintain. You want to see it? Sarah gestured toward the train car's entrance, offering to her a substitute for conversation neither of them seemed equipped to handle. Inside, Jennifer moved through the space with the slow attention of someone cataloging changes since last encounter. She paused at the photograph of their parents, framed now and mounted on the wall where Sarah could see it daily. Mom would have loved this. Building something with your hands. That's why I'm doing it. Sarah heard truth in the words as she spoke them, recognizing that restoration had become more than survival strategy. It had become connection to parents who taught her that work itself could be prayer when nothing else remained. I brought something. Jennifer handed over an envelope, thick with bills, that suggested she'd visited an ATM specifically for this purpose. $1,500 from savings. It's not enough to make up for 2 years, but it's what I can do right now. Sarah held the money that would have solved her crisis 2 days earlier. Before Thomas's inheritance had arrived through channels she still didn't quite believe were real. Keep it, or donate it to the vocational program at the fundraiser. Thomas Morrison left me money, enough to cover everything. Jennifer's expression cycled through confusion, relief, and something that might have been disappointment at having her gesture of reconciliation rendered unnecessary. You can stay. For the fundraiser, if you want. The invitation felt risky, opening doors she'd sealed for self-protection, but Jennifer nodded with relief that suggested she'd feared rejection was inevitable and deserved. Saturday arrived clear and cold, temperature hovering near zero but without wind that would make outdoor gathering unbearable. People began arriving at 4 p.m., earlier than the advertised 6 o'clock start, bringing casseroles and baked goods and auction items wrapped in newspaper. Sarah watched from the train car's doorway as her small property filled with neighbors she barely knew. Classmates of Tyler's she'd met once. Adults who'd heard about the project third hand and decided it warranted their Saturday evening. Frank had constructed a small stage from pallets, positioned near the train car, where musicians could plug into Sarah's solar-powered system. String lights donated by the church hung between trees, creating illumination that transformed utilitarian workspace into something approaching festive. Fire barrels provided warmth for people who clustered around them, stamping feet and breathing clouds of vapor while waiting for events to begin. By 6 p.m., over 200 people had gathered. Sarah stood beside Tyler and Jennifer, overwhelmed by the sheer number of humans occupying space she'd grown accustomed to experiencing alone. The crowd represented collective decision that her struggle mattered, that one woman's attempt to survive through skilled labor and stubborn refusal to quit deserved community support. Mrs. Coleman took the stage with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention from rooms full of people. Thank you all for coming. We're here tonight because Sarah Bennett showed us something important. That determination matters, that skills matter, that refusing to give up when the world says you should matters. She outlined Sarah's story, bought a rusted train car for $500, transformed it through months of relentless work, now facing deadlines and permit fees that threatened everything she'd built. The narrative simplified complexities Sarah had lived through, but captured essential truth that sometimes surviving required help nobody should have to ask for. Tonight we're going to make sure she can finish what she started, because that's what communities do. We show up. Mrs. Coleman's words carried conviction that made Sarah's throat tighten with emotions she'd successfully suppressed for months. The musicians took the stage, folk band whose repertoire included songs about trains and travel, and homes built from nothing in places that didn't offer easy living. The music filled cold air with melodies that seemed designed specifically for this gathering, for people who understood that rootedness came not from wealth but from choosing to stay in places that required constant effort to inhabit. Tyler pulled Sarah toward the fire barrel where kids his age had congregated, introducing her to classmates with the pride of someone showing off important discovery. This is Sarah. She's teaching me welding and carpentry and electrical systems. His friends looked at her with the careful assessment children bring to adults who exist outside normal categories like teacher or parent. The auction began at 7:30, Mrs. Coleman calling out items while Frank kept tally of bids. Sarah's metal sculptures sold for amounts that seemed impossible. $80 for welded artwork she'd made from scrap. $150 for a piece she'd thought was practice rather than something worthy of display. Frank's handmade chairs brought $200 each. Grace's quilts commanded prices that made her gasp audibly. Local paintings, gift certificates from businesses, hand-knitted items from elderly women who'd spent weeks preparing contributions. The auction generated money faster than Sarah could track. Tyler took the stage at 8:15, had asked to speak despite visible nervousness about addressing 200 people. His voice came out quiet at first, gradually strengthening as he found his footing. "I'm Tyler. Before I met Sarah, I spent afternoons alone doing nothing. Then I found the train car, and she let me help even though she didn't have to." He talked about learning tools and techniques, about discovering he was good at things nobody had given him chance to attempt, about how the train car had become the place he felt most himself. "Sarah taught me that broken things aren't garbage. They're opportunities. And I think maybe people are like that too." The applause when he finished was immediate and sustained, adults and children responding to honesty delivered without performance or manipulation. Sarah felt tears she'd successfully suppressed finally breaking through, running down her cheeks in the cold air, and didn't bother wiping them away. Frank spoke next, telling the story of Thomas Morrison and the network of assistance that had sustained him through his own crisis. This train car saved Thomas's life 50 years ago. Now it's saving Sarah's, and by helping her, we're honoring everyone who helped us when we needed it. That's legacy. That's what lasts. Mrs. Coleman announced totals at 8:45. Concert ticket donations totaling $1,340, auction proceeds of $3,100, direct contributions of $1,860. Total raised $6,300. Sarah climbed onto the stage before Mrs. Coleman could gesture her forward, knowing what needed to be said. "You've given me something incredible tonight. Not just money, but proof that community means showing up when someone needs help." She paused, looking out at faces illuminated by fire barrels and string lights. "But I need to tell you something. Thomas Morrison, the man who lived in this train car 40 years ago, he left money, an inheritance for whoever took on restoring it, enough to cover my permits and taxes." Confusion rippled through the crowd, people processing this information and what it meant for the money they just raised. "So here's what I want to do." Sarah pulled the check Jennifer had offered from her pocket. "My sister brought $1,500 to help. The fundraiser raised $6,300. That's $7,900 total. Mrs. Coleman's been trying to fund a vocational education program for 3 years. I'd like to donate this money to make that happen, to create something that helps other people the way Thomas helped me, the way you've all helped me." The applause started slowly, building to sustained noise that felt like approval. Mrs. Coleman wiped her eyes, nodded acceptance of responsibility that came with this gift. Music resumed after Sarah finished speaking, folk songs about resilience and stubbornness and refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. People danced near the stage, stamped feet to stay warm, shared food from tables laden with contributions. Sarah stood with Tyler and Jennifer and Grace and Frank, watching her small piece of Wyoming transform into something that felt like celebration. Monday morning, Sarah drove to the county office with Thomas's check converted to cashier's check made out to the county. The clerk processed her building permit application without comment, beyond noting that inspection would be scheduled within 2 weeks. $750 purchased official acknowledgement that her train car could exist legally on her property. Property tax payment followed, $2,400 that cleared the debt hanging over everything she'd built. The relief felt physical, tension she hadn't fully recognized releasing from muscles that had been clenched since receiving foreclosure warnings. The inspection happened Friday, county official walking through the train car with clipboard and measuring tape. He checked electrical systems, examined the stove installation, verified structural soundness of the frame and foundation. The solar panels drew particular scrutiny before he grudgingly approved them as meeting code for off-grid residential use. Temporary occupancy permit, good for 2 years. After that, you'll need to apply for permanent status, but you're legal for now. He handed over paperwork that represented bureaucratic approval, official permission to continue existing in the space she'd created. That afternoon brought Douglas Reeves up the driveway in an SUV too clean for rural roads. The developer had been notably absent from the fundraiser, but rumors suggested he'd heard about it through the channels that made privacy impossible in small towns. Ms. Bennett, he approached with body language that suggested he'd rehearsed this conversation. I'm withdrawing my offer for your property. Gimhaya, Sarah kept her voice neutral, uncertain whether this represented victory or a different kind of threat. Because I was wrong. Douglas gestured at the train car at the workshop area where Tyler was helping organize tools. What you've built here, it's not just construction, it's community. My father spent 40 years developing properties, made plenty of money, but he never built anything like this. Something that brings people together instead of just existing. He extended his hand for a handshake that felt like concession rather than peace treaty. Keep your land, keep your train car. I'll invest elsewhere. The weeks that followed the fundraiser settled into rhythm. Sarah hadn't experienced since her father was alive. Days structured around work that mattered, evenings spent with people who'd chosen to show up. November passed in a blur of final weatherproofing, small improvements funded by Thomas's inheritance, preparations for the first winter in her restored home. December arrived with snow that transformed the landscape into variations of white and gray, accumulated drifts that required shoveling and insulation that proved its worth through weeks of sub-zero temperatures. The train car's first real winter tested every repair Sarah had completed, revealed weaknesses that required ongoing maintenance, but held together in ways that validated months of work. Christmas came quietly. Jennifer drove from Denver despite road conditions, brought gifts wrapped in newspaper comics the way their mother used to. Tyler appeared Christmas morning with Grace, both carrying dishes for a dinner that expanded to include Frank and Mrs. Coleman, and 3 of Tyler's classmates whose parents had heard that the train car lady didn't have family nearby. They ate sitting on mismatched furniture in a space that smelled like wood smoke and pine boughs Tyler had cut from the property. It felt, Sarah realized with surprise, like home in ways her father's barn had never managed. January brought the brutal cold that defined Wyoming winters, weeks when temperature never rose above zero, and going outside required layers that made movement awkward. Sarah worked in the new workshop building community labor had constructed, teaching Tyler advanced welding while they waited for metal to warm enough for outdoor repairs. Grace's sewing circle met weekly despite weather, women arriving bundled in coats they didn't remove until the stove had the interior warm enough to shed layers. By March, Sarah had lived in the train car through a complete winter cycle, understood its rhythms and requirements in ways that only sustained habitation could teach. The solar system needed panel cleaning after snow accumulation. The stovepipe required inspection monthly to prevent creosote buildup. Water management meant constant attention to preventing freeze damage. But these challenges felt manageable. Problems with known solutions rather than crises threatening her continued existence. When spring finally arrived in late April, snow melting into mud season that turned her property into obstacle course of puddles and sucking earth, Sarah marked the anniversary of buying the train car by reviewing Thomas Morrison's notebook one more time. She'd filled the remaining blank pages with her own observations and drawings, contributing to accumulated knowledge that might benefit whoever came next, because she'd learned that tools and wisdom were meant to be passed forward rather than hoarded. 6 months had elapsed since the fundraiser. Sarah woke one Saturday morning in May to find her property transformed by a gathering she hadn't organized. 30 people had arrived bearing food and tools, announced intention to build the workshop structure's second phase, a covered area for storing lumber and materials that would expand her capacity to take on larger repair projects. By evening, the framing was complete. By the following Saturday, walls and roof had been added. 2 weekends of collective labor produced a building that expanded her capacity to teach skills to kids like Tyler, who needed purpose, to host projects too large for the train car's limited space. Through late spring and into summer, the workshop became a hub of activity that extended beyond Sarah's own projects. Tyler essentially moved in during school vacation, learning techniques that his father's death had seemed to eliminate as possibilities. Grace started bringing other single mothers whose children needed supervision, and Sarah found herself running informal apprenticeship program that taught welding and carpentry to teenagers who otherwise would have spent summers disconnected from work that built competence. Mrs. Coleman formalized the arrangement in August, proposing that the county vocational program partner with Sarah to offer credited courses in practical skills. The proposal came with small stipend, $500 monthly for teaching 2 afternoons per week. That represented Sarah's first regular income since Hartwell Mechanic Shop had closed. By September, when Tyler returned to school and the informal summer program ended, Sarah had taught basic welding to 15 students and advanced techniques to 3 who showed genuine aptitude. 2 had already secured apprenticeships with Frank's carpentry business. 1 was applying to vocational college with recommendation letter Sarah had written describing skills that couldn't be captured by standardized tests. The train car itself had evolved beyond emergency shelter into permanent home. All windows held glass. Interior walls had been sanded and sealed. The sleeping area contained actual bed. Kitchen corner had propane stove. The space was small but complete, everything necessary contained within 85 feet of restored steel. One evening in October, sitting on the train car's steps with Tyler beside her while they worked on a motorcycle engine someone had brought for repair, Sarah tried to articulate what had changed beyond obvious transformation. It's not just fixing broken things. It's learning that being broken doesn't mean being finished. Tyler nodded, understanding that came from experience rather than theory. He'd arrived carrying loneliness like weight, found purpose in work that connected hands to materials in ways that made sense when words failed. Grace called from inside where she was preparing dinner. Tyler, Sarah, come eat while it's hot. They went inside to space that smelled like cooking food and motor oil and wood smoke, to gathering of people who'd assembled not because they had to, but because they'd chosen to show up. To community built one repair at a time until the accumulated work of many hands created something that lasted. Sarah looked around the interior she'd restored through months of effort that had seemed impossible until completion revealed it had been merely difficult. Thomas Morrison had been right. Broken things could be beautiful again. But what he hadn't written, what she'd learned through experience, was that sometimes the most meaningful repairs happen in the spaces between people who decide that showing up matters more than staying comfortable. That persistence outlasts every obstacle if you're willing to try one more time.
Und der ist auch.
Flash auf die Wall durch. Huh?
Mix
Alle
mit
da?
20.
Wall ist
Die
down.
Wall geht runter, ne?
Mhm.
Gleich.
Kannst du noch so eine One-Way setzen, Jos?
Kein für Flank gerade.
Zwei Backside bei euch.
Ja, okay, die Rainer ist durch.
Viper
bist
low
du?
am Main-Eingang.
One enemy remaining.
Der hat 180 gemacht.
Hinter dir, hinter dir. Ja, schön, auf geht's. Oh, ich war gemutet. Ich hab hinter dir gesagt, sorry.
Wenn die Wall da ist euch irgendeine andere Smoke lieber? Auf
Ja,
Flank
erstmal-
oder so?
erstmal
Ich finde die eigentlich ganz geil.
Die Wall muss hier.
Okay,
Ich glaube
Also
actually, dass man
solange-
jede Runde da...
Okay, ich mach die Wall anders.
im Mittel.
okay.
Weil, wenn ich hier hinten durchgehe, kann ich von.
Ja, der
Wir
wird irgendwie
brauchen
mein
halt
Tag haben und
zumindest
dann
nicht beide Smokes zeitgleich.
bin ich hier überhaupt
Das
im
wär
privaten Modus, ich weiß es gar nicht.
Mach einfach am Anfang der
Egal,
Runde
scheiß drauf.
auch hier und dann müssen die da oben top.
Es war aber auch ein
ausstellen.
Testbot. Vorher stand so da Testbot und dann kam lange nix und dann kamen die ganzen Requests.